Hello and welcome. As you can see, I'm back in the forest and it's really a lot of snow here. So we have nearly half a meter snow everywhere. It's really fantastic. So nobody's here. You are alone in the forest. Perfect weather. If you're in the Java or Kotlin world, you have to deal somehow with graphical user interfaces, and then you have techniques like JavaFX for desktop apps, or you have Vaadin for web apps. Whatever you're choosing, they have some principles and in common. And I don't want to focus on JavaFX or Vaadin or whatever technique. I am writing here more or less pseudocode, but I want to show the difference between this inheritance and delegation. And the first thing we want to highlight is how to build this composition of text box and buttons for a dialog or page if you're using inheritance. If you're talking about this graphical user interface or this frameworks that will give you this component, then you can see that they have some kind of inheritance. Mostly it's in the same way. I'm not focusing on JavaFX or Vaadin here, but mostly you can see that they have, for example, some kind of abstract component. This is a class where they are implementing basic functionality. On top of this, you will find something like an interface called component, so that you have this abstraction layer. And from the abstract component, so first the interface component, then the abstract class, abstract component, and from this it's mostly splitting up in different parsers. Parsers, I mean, you have components that are more for the layouting, so you have this abstract layout, or you have direct and vertical layout or horizontal layout. On the other side, you have something that is leading to interaction, like a buttons that is inherited from abstract component, or something like text fields. Whatever you have these different paths, and they are all leading to some kind of abstract component, mostly. Okay, one thing is now, if you're writing your own graphical user interface, you have to decide if you're developing your own component, something like a text field, like a button, really a basic component, or if you want to create something like a dialog, a page that is more or less a composition of basic elements. And we want to have a look at this, how to build this composition based on these basic elements. And we are just following the path with inheritance. So with inheritance, we are building something like a page or a dialog. Okay, if you're reading documentation from this framework, then sometimes you see advice like the following. You have a class and you should extend from a layout you want to have as a base layout for your component. It's a page, it's a dialog, whatever. So for example, you could choose a horizontal layout, and then what it looks like is my component extends horizontal layout. The composition itself is done during the time you're creating this. For example, inside the constructor, they're creating the text field, the button, and so on, and building all this stuff together. But what we reached with this, if I'm taking this component and giving this one to my colleague, what he sees is a class name and the documentation, and it has some use case, some semantic meaning that is focusing on a use case. But if I'm looking at the API from this class, what I see is that it looks like a horizontal layout if I choose horizontal layout to extend from. And that is not the inheritance or the isolation I want to have, because I want to have just the signatures from this use case. For example, add something, remove something, activate something, whatever. So if I start with inheritance from this base layouts, what they are mentioning inside the documentation of these frameworks, I am extending a special version of a layout, for example, and this is not what I want to have. But what could we do? So we have two different paths we can go, and one path is based on inheritance as well. Let's see if this one is better. Okay, we saw what happened if you're using the inheritance based on a layout, for example. So we choose a horizontal layout, and what we had was a component that was a layout, a specialized layout. This we don't want to have. So what is the next component level, or what would be the point where we can connect through if you want to go over inheritance? For example, if you want to build one of these basic elements like a text field, a button or whatever, the logical point to connect through would be something like the abstract component. Why? because there is no specific component feature already, but the generic framework features are implemented already. Means you have all the support from the framework, but you have to do all this generic or this component specific stuff by yourself. This could be good if you're designing your own component, but on the other side, if you're just using this one for building a composition of base components, it could be that you have to implement framework specific things that just needed to be implemented by a dedicated basic component. So this is a little bit, this depends on the framework you're using, but in general I would say if you just build basic components like a text field, like a combo box or whatever, go to the abstract component layer and just use this one as inheritance point. But if you want to build a composition itself, this is not the perfect thing, because it could be that it's more or less a handling of a component. You're not building a component, you're building a composition. So what would be an abstraction layer you could choose so that you don't have to implement basic framework methods just to build a composition of existing components. And what we could do at this point, we will see as next. Okay, we saw what challenges we have if we are choosing inheritance for our composition. So if we have this abstract component and then we have to implement some stuff, or we are extending from a base component and then we are just creating a specialized component of this one. So this we don't want to have. So the final target would be that we have a component that is in the framework like a plain component without any specialization, and on the other side I want to have just the methods exported that are necessary to fulfill my use case. So for this, what I need for this is something like a composite. So we have a class composite extends abstract component. Inside this implementation, we are implementing all these framework specific things that we need to create a component. This is a one-time effort we have to do. This composite could be of type whatever. It could be typed if you need this information because you want to have something like a method like a get holder component or whatever, so that this is typed. But in the end, what we are doing is we are overwriting the constructor or factory method of this composite. Inside this method we are implementing the composition, so we are creating all these compositions we want to have. All these pieces of this composition could be an internal attribute of this final composite, and the only thing that we are making available for the outside are the methods with a semantic or with a use case specific semantic names like setting, bill name, bill number, purchase order, accepting this, or so all these semantic names instead of set text, click, action listener or whatever. So what we reach with this, we encapsulate it with this one-time implementation of type or this class called composite. We are doing all this stuff that's necessary for the framework to fulfill the needs, and then the next thing is we can just use the constructor, for example, to build the whole composition inside an instance, and then we are extending the method signatures just with this what we need to fulfill our use case. That's it. So we are not running into these inheritance challenges. We have all possibilities that Java will give us, and on the other side we have really use case specific compositions based on core components of the framework. And this is why I love this delegation compared to the inheritance, because this is a very clean way to make this abstraction layer and to provide a component that is really focusing on the use case you want to implement. Okay, we saw now that we have this composite, but there is a language feature in Java that we can use to make sure that another colleague, or maybe yourself if you're lazy, not start to inherit from this composite as well. I'm talking here explicitly about the keyword final. So most people know this keyword final inside a method, inside the source code you're writing, but not during the time you are declaring a class, but you can do it explicitly here. So use the final keyword during the time you are declaring the class. You can have some typing with generics if you need it. For example, if you want to have this get holder component or whatever, it depends a little bit how you want to push the composition of components into this instance of this composite. But if you want to make sure that nobody starts inheriting from this class you're providing, so that you are just making sure that the usage of this class is clean in a way you define it, just think about making this class final. Okay, it's time for the conclusion. So what we saw how this inheritance way can influence the way you're using the components and you're providing your own components or compositions. We saw that if you want to create basic components like a text field, a button or whatever, it's a good way to start with inheritance in this layer where it's called abstract component, or you have some abstract button or whatever. But if you want to deal with pure compositions of existing components, I personally recommend to think about the implementation of an composite. This can be typed or not. You can make it final or not. It depends how you want to make sure how to use it, if it's possible to inherit from. But if you're using this approach of creating a composite, you have just available the methods that are used for this, or the use case specific methods that you want to have for this composition. This is a very clean way and clean abstraction layer that I personally prefer, and well, maybe you like it as well after you tried it. If you like this video, I would really like to see you as my subscriber and turn on the bell so that you know if I'm pushing a new video to this CoreJava series or some other videos on my channel. And for me, the day is more or less done. I will walk a little bit through the forest. It's time for warm coffee, definitely, and then my day is done. So have a nice day and see you on my channel.